Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. This is the second part of the blood supply of the head and neck, and in this video we'll focus on the blood supply of the brain, in which we will discuss the circle of Willis that is comprised of the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery. So again, let's start from the arc of aorta. So we have the left subclavian artery here and the left common carotid artery here. Similarly, we'll have the right common carotid artery and the right subclavian artery on the right side. The common carotid artery on both left and right side, these will bifurcate into the external carotid artery and the internal carotid artery. The external carotid artery we have already discussed, and that will supply the neck and the face, and the internal carotid artery, that will move upward and that will supply the brain. Similarly, a branch from the subclavian artery moves upward, that is called the vertebral artery, and that will also move upward and form the circle of Willis and supply the brain. Okay, let me give you a brief introduction first and then we'll move into the details. So actually we have the internal carotid artery here that will move upward and anteriorly, and that will form the anterior circulation of the brain here. And similarly we will have the vertebral artery here that will move upward and posteriorly, and that will supply the posterior part of the brain. And here they both will form a circle that is called the circle of Willis. It's a lateral view, so I can only show the left side of the internal carotid artery and the vertebral artery, but keep in mind that two similar arteries will ascend upward on the right side as well. It's not the actual anatomical diagram, I just made this to make you understand. Now we'll go into the details using another diagram. Okay, so this is the super simplest diagram of the blood supply of the brain, and this is the inferior view of the brain. Just imagine that you are standing in the spinal cord and you are looking upward, and you will see this view of the brain. So these two arteries we are seeing here, these are the vertebral arteries. These are moving upward, and these will enter through the transverse foramen. These will enter through C6 vertebra, the transverse foramen of the C6 vertebra, and these will exit at the C2 here. This will exit here at the C2, the transverse foramen of the second cervical vertebra. Now it will give a branch here, and this one is called pica. Posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and as the name indicates, it will supply the posterior inferior part of the cerebellum. Now another branch will arise from pica actually, and this one is called posterior spinal artery, and this will supply the posterior part of the spinal cord here. Now moving upward, these will again actually the vertebral artery this time. This will give two branches here that will unite here, and this will be called the anterior spinal artery. So this will supply the anterior part of the spinal cord. Moving upward at the junction of pons and medulla oblongata, the vertebral arteries, these will get united, and this thick artery, this one, it is formed. This is called basilar artery. The vertebral artery will unite and form the basilar artery, and the first branch from the basilar artery will be ica. This is anterior inferior cerebellar artery. This was posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So the inferior part of the cerebellum is done here. Now moving upward, the basilar artery will give two more branches. Actually not two, these are a bunch of branches, and these are called the labyrinthine arteries. They are called, I'll write here because it will supply the inner ear. I'm not sure with the spelling, but these are called the labyrinthine arteries, and the reason I have written these here because this will supply the inner ear. Okay, moving upward, the basilar arteries will give few more branches, and these are called, let me change my pen. Okay, these are called pontine arteries. These are called pontine arteries, and as the name indicates, it will supply the pons. Moving upward, as we have completed the inferior part of cerebellum, the blood supply inferior part of cerebellum, now these arteries will supply the superior part of cerebellum. So simply these will be called superior. I need a pen. Superior cerebellar arteries. The inferior part was supplied by two arteries, the pica and ica, and the superior part is supplied by superior cerebellar artery. And finally, the basilar artery will bifurcate into two here, and this is called the posterior cerebral artery. These two are called the posterior cerebral artery, and this branch here, this is called the posterior communicating artery. It is called so because this is the anterior circulation of the brain. Okay, this is called posterior communicating artery because this is the anterior circulation of the brain and this is the posterior circulation of the brain, and through this is actually the bridge artery. This will unite the anterior and posterior circulation of the brain. The vertebral arteries are done here. Now we will move into the carotid arteries, internal carotid arteries. Again, diving into this diagram. So this was the vertebral artery, and actually there will be two. So vertebral arteries, and that entered through the foramen magnum here, and I already described all the branches, the pica, ica, and the posterior cerebral artery. These were the major, and posterior communicating artery also. Now this is the internal carotid artery, and this will enter here through the carotid canal into the cranial cavity, and this artery actually has four parts. This is the internal carotid artery in the neck, so this is called the cervical artery here. This part is called cervical part. Then here it is inside the carotid canal, so as it's inside the bone, so it is called the petrous part. This part is called the petrous part. Then we know there is cavernous sinus here. Here we have the cavernous sinus, so this part is embedded in the cavernous sinus, so this is called the cavernous part. And then this is called the cerebral part, the cervical part, petrous part, cervical, petrous, cavernous, and cerebral part. Now, why the internal carotid is clinically important? Because it is here embedded in the cavernous sinus, right? And we also know that the cranial nerve 6, that is also embedded in the cavernous sinus. So if there is any baroaneurysm or any kind of bulging of this artery here in this part, that can affect the 6th cranial nerve, and as we know that supplies the lateral rectus, LR6. So lateral rectus is supplied by 6th cranial nerve, and that is a muscle of the eye, lateral rectus. Okay, so if this is affected, so we will have eye problem, we will have the medial strabismus, and we will have the diplopia and all those problems. So the internal carotid artery here is clinically important. Another clinically important thing to be remembered is that the cranial nerve 3 will arise here, the cranial nerve 3, the cumulator nerve. Between these two arteries, the superior cerebellar artery and the posterior cerebral artery. And if this nerve is compromised somehow here between these two arteries by baroaneurysm or whatever, so there will be eye problem, because third cranial nerve that supplies the major muscles of the eye. You can remember this mnemonic: LR6 and SO4. So the lateral rectus of the eye is supplied by 6th cranial nerve, the superior oblique is supplied by 4th cranial nerve, and the remaining all are supplied by 3rd cranial nerve. Okay, so this was the posterior circulation of the brain, and this is the bridge. And now we will dive into the anterior circulation of the brain, that is made by the internal carotid artery here. I have already described how it moves upward into the cranial cavity. Now we will discuss the branches. So there are the main branches are this one is the ophthalmic artery that will supply the eye, and this is the middle cerebral artery, and the branch from middle cerebral artery, these are called the lenticulostriates artery. And this artery here, this one, this is the anterior cerebral artery, and there is a bridge between them. This is called the anterior communicating artery. So let's explain one by one. The first branch here, this is the ophthalmic artery, and that will supply the eyes. There will be several branches of this, but the most important is central artery of retina. So if this artery is blocked or damaged, most probably by diabetes, so we can have the blindness here. Then after the ophthalmic artery, the other branch is, this one is called the middle cerebral artery. This is called the middle cerebral artery, and several branches from the middle cerebral arteries arise, and these are called lenticulostriate arteries. Okay, so lenticulostriate artery, these will supply the internal capsule, the putamen, the globus pallidus, and the caudate nucleus, etc. All those things, all those structures near the midbrain. The middle cerebral artery will supply the core of the brain, like the middle part. I will in the end I'll show you a diagram to make you understand visually. And then this branch is called, this one, this is called anterior cerebral artery. This is called anterior cerebral artery, and this will supply mostly the frontal lobe. And then we have a bridge between these two arteries, the anterior cerebral arteries, and this is called anterior communicating. That will be a communication between these two anterior communicating arteries. This one was posterior communicating artery. Okay, so let's discuss the blood supply of the major arteries here: the posterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and the anterior cerebral artery. The first one is the posterior cerebral artery. So it will supply, as the name indicates, it will supply the occipital lobe, the posterior lobe called the occipital lobe, and also the posterior, middle, and inferior part of the temporal lobe. Okay, so this is the lateral lobe, lateral view of the brain, and it will supply the occipital lobe here and the posterior middle part of the temporal lobe. This blue one is this is the supply of posterior cerebral artery, we can see here, and this is the mid sagittal view, and we can see this blue part. This is the supply of posterior cerebral artery. Okay, so this is the middle cerebral artery, and it will supply the lateral part of the brain. Although I think we can say that it will supply the core of the brain, except the superior frontal of the brain, the inferior temporal of the brain, and the parietal. Okay, so it will supply the lateral and the middle and the lateral part of the brain. You can see the red part. This is the supply of middle cerebral artery. And the last part is the anterior cerebral artery, this one, anterior cerebral artery, and it will supply the superior medial of the frontal lobe and the anterior part of the parietal lobe. Let me explain. So if these are the cerebral hemisphere, okay, these are the two cerebral hemispheres. So this artery will supply the medial and the superior. The lateral is already supplied by the other artery, right? So it will supply this medial and superior part of the frontal lobe and the anterior part of the parietal lobe as well. We can see in this diagram as well. This is the lateral view, so it will supply the superior middle of the frontal lobe, and this is the mid-sagittal view, so we can see it has supplied all the medial part of the frontal lobe, and here we can see the superior part. The yellow indicates the supply of the anterior cerebral artery. Okay, so again, this is the posterior circulation of the brain, this is the anterior circulation of the brain. We have the vertebral arteries here, and the first branches are called pica, posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and these will give branches called posterior spinal artery. Then direct branches from vertebral artery are called anterior spinal artery. Then at the junction of pons and medulla oblongata, these two arteries combine and form the basilar artery. The first branch from basilar artery is the AICA, anterior inferior cerebellar artery, then labyrinthine artery, then pontine arteries, and then superior cerebellar artery. At the end, we have the posterior cerebral artery and the posterior communicating artery. Now, the internal carotid artery will move upward, and that will give the first branch called the middle cerebral artery. Yes, middle cerebral artery. Then it will give branch called ophthalmic artery that will supply the eye. Then we have small branches called lenticular-striate arteries, and then at the last we have anterior cerebral and anterior communicating arteries. And this is the circle of Willis around this is optic chiasma, and we have the pituitary gland here. So the circle of Willis is made around the optic chiasma and the pituitary gland here. Thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe my channel, and this will give me a lot of courage to make more videos like this. Thank you so much.